Hello and welcome to another video trying to get you the very top grades. In today's video I'm going to teach you 7 things to do in your Macbeth essay, and I'm going to use an essay that scored 100% of marks, as you know. You'll get to understand the mark scheme, so level 6 is the top level in the mark scheme where grades 7 to 9 live, and you'll find out what convincing is, what it means when you're critical. It doesn't mean that you're just criticizing, it means that you're evaluating, and it'll show you what exploration looks like and a lot of the vocabulary at the sides here. You will also see why the examiner has given it a level 6 for AO1, AO2 and AO3, which you remember are the arguments of the writer, the terminology that you use, and the context that you manage to bring in to prove your point. And the essay comes to us from the marvellous Ipti Chowdhury, who has kindly sent these in so that you can learn from them. He said, "Mr. Salles, your videos helped me a lot to get such great marks, as well as other things, not just my videos." He's obviously studied hard, and he wants to give something back to the viewers. So Ipti, thank you so much. Let's jump into his essay. Arguably, Shakespeare develops Macbeth and Banquo's attitudes as evolving standpoints shaped by their moral endurance against the trials of human kindness. Now, I love this introduction because it uses a quotation from the play and it sets up this idea of a contrast. And so what we've got is the contrast of Macbeth's morality against the idea of a trial that he's being tested. Now, as you will know from my videos, you always need to talk about the characters as a construct. In other words, they are constructed by the author Shakespeare in order to do something. So here, Ipti says Shakespeare has constructed Macbeth and constructed Banquo and their standpoints in order to put them on trial. And these will be evolving standpoints because Banquo will stay true to his morality, but Macbeth won't. He will change his moral position. So we've got a really sophisticated introduction there that tells the examiner that Ipti is going to be arguing a rather complex case about both characters. Shakespeare presents Banquo's primary attitude with skepticism based on Jacobean religiosity and superstitions. He proclaims, "Instruments of darkness, tell us truth, win us with honest trifles to betray us." Shakespeare recalls the motif of witchcraft as Banquo classes the witches as instruments of darkness. The connotations of spiritual malpractice and eeriness within Banquo's stance is a way Shakespeare builds regard and esteem for him in the eyes of the audience, who would be strongly opposed to all forms of sorcery. Okay, there are 2 things going on here that I want to bring to your attention. The first thing are the boxes in blue, and these are the superb vocabulary choices that Ipti is making. So he knows when he's writing about Macbeth, he always has to mention it as being the Jacobean period. He's uncovered this idea of recurring images being a motif, and this is a really useful way of looking at the play because it is full of recurring images, and we're going to see one later which gives this full marks. So here we've got the motif of witchcraft, and what he's saying is that that idea keeps occurring. When he's talking about witchcraft, he uses vocabulary of the time, sorcery, and he's thinking about Shakespeare's point of view, Christian morality. So excellent vocabulary choices, which you must steal because these will fit any essay about Lady Macbeth, Macbeth, Banquo, or witchcraft. So steal that vocabulary. But in red, I've got the quotation that he zoomed in on, instruments of darkness. So why am I saying but here when he zoomed in on a quotation. And that's because IPTI hasn't analysed this choice of words. What he says about the quotation is really what he's saying about witchcraft, not an analysis of the actual words. And that's why there's no examiner comment at the side here giving this a grade. But set against that, the vocabulary has told the examiner that IPTI's answer is going to be brilliant. So the examiner wants to give it a really good mark, even though they haven't got evidence yet for the assessment objectives, AO1 and AO2. They will have evidence for the terminology, sorry, AO1 and AO3. They will have evidence for AO2, the terminology, which you can see in blue. So let's now look at the rest of the page and see what has got the examiner excited to give IPTI level 5 for the author's ideas and for the terminology. To build regard and esteem for him in the eyes of the audience. So this is the regard for Banquo because he's a moral character, who would be strongly opposed to all forms of sorcery. Although Banquo's Christian morality is commendable here, Shakespeare challenges it when the witches prophesies he will attain greater and lesser than Macbeth. The use of equivocation presents the supernatural as deceitful. The structural use of the oxymoronic phrase condemns the nature of witchcraft as multifaceted. The fact Banquo shows interest in the promise of a noble line of successors is Shakespeare teaching the audience even the most valiant can have their whole moral infrastructure shaken by the evil of the. Okay, in blue we have these vocabulary choices again that meet the terminology requirement of the exam. Christian morality. Equivocation, this idea of putting opposites together and saying we can't really judge which is best, being greater than Macbeth or lesser than Macbeth. And structural use of the oxymoronic phrase. So this idea of two opposites being joined together is an oxymoron. So the examiner's impressed by the language, level 5. The examiner isn't yet impressed by the ideas that IPTI has expressed. Well, not enough for the level 6. The level 5 is pretty good. And I've underlined in red where IPTI is writing about Shakespeare's purpose. So Shakespeare wants to challenge this idea of the witches' prophecies, and he wants to teach his audience that even moral people like Banquo will be tested. Remember that trial idea that he set up in his introduction. So Banquo is going to be put on trial by fate, if you like, or by the supernatural in order to test his moral certainty. So what's going on in the examiner's head at the minute is that IPTI's answer is thoughtful and developed and it's considered, but this examiner's gut reaction is I'm not convinced yet. Okay? And that is a gut reaction. Another examiner would have read the same stuff and said, actually, I think we're starting to get into level 6 now. And I'm not saying this to complain about examiners. I'm just trying to show you how the examiner's mind works. No two English teachers completely agree about everything. That's just the nature of the subject. And so your real tactic is to keep going. If you keep having stuff that's thoughtful, eventually the sheer weight of that thoughtful stuff will become convincing. And so you don't need any extra skill, you just keep going at the same skill, and then you get enough of it that the examiner says, right, I think this is now a convincing argument. And so in a really short space of time, from here to here, we can see that the examiner becomes convinced. Let's read. So the moral infrastructure shaken by the evil of the supernatural reality. Let's just move that to the top of the screen so we can read this chunk. The theme of the supernatural is employed by Shakespeare to destabilize Macbeth's integrity and to return his increasing attraction with moral failure. Macbeth's growing inclination towards supernatural soliciting leaves him in a perplexed, self-questioning state, Why hath it given me earnest of success, commencing in the truth? Linguistically, the sibilance of supernatural soliciting is deliberately used by Shakespeare to raise his audience's alarm, given the satanic connotations and reference to devastating sorcery in the form of soliciting. Right, let's analyse the stuff in the box that has the examiner so excited. So first we've got the idea of the supernatural being a theme, and then we've got the idea of this being a construct that Shakespeare has deliberately put in the play through the language employed by Shakespeare. Then we have Shakespeare's first purpose, which is to destabilise Macbeth's integrity. Great terminology here. What he means is we no longer trust Macbeth as a good person, as a hero. He now becomes the anti-hero once the supernatural takes hold of him. And we've got again this idea of returning to his increasing attraction with moral failure. Remember that idea of the trial and the word developing that we had in the introduction, where Ipti has constructed an argument that says it's not just black and white. Macbeth starts as a hero and then becomes evil. He's talking about this being a journey of a temptation, if you like, of increasing attraction. And that becomes a sophisticated argument, which he carries on here with Macbeth's not his inclination, but his growing inclination. So we've got the sense of the character's journey towards the supernatural soliciting. Well, now the examiner's convinced that we've got a conceptualized response. So students often say to me, well, what does conceptualized mean? You know, what on earth is that on about? And my translation of that is, you start your essay with a thesis, an argument, and then you try and prove it as you write. So remember at the beginning, Ipti's thesis, the argument, was that the moral endurance was going to be put on trial, but this would evolve and develop. And that's what the examiners got excited about, because Ipti is now going back to that idea of this development. And that's what makes it a conceptualized response now. Right, as we carry on the page, we've got level 6 reference for AO1 and AO3 all over the place. So we're going to learn a lot about earning top marks from this page. Likewise, Macbeth's rhetorical question is used by Shakespeare to create a self-doubting, unstable and malevolent fallacy created by the engagement with the agents of the dark. Overall, this does diminish Macbeth's moral endurance and does lead to his moral failure given his declining heroism. Before Macbeth turned into the witch's blasphemous regime, he valiantly fought in the path of God, as he defeated a treacherous thane, unseamed him, and fixed his head. So let's pause there. What's going on here is we've got this analysis of the language that would have been in the extract, and now suddenly Ipti is going elsewhere in the play to different events and different quotations. That also helps you to be conceptualized, because you're looking at the journey of the character. In the beginning he was like this, but now he's becoming more like that, and that's preparing you for the end when he's like this. And Ipti has got some phrases that help him do that. He knows he's going to write about Macbeth's moral failure, no matter what the question. He knows the questions of Macbeth, he's going to write about his declining heroism. And these uses of vocabulary are really helpful to him. In fact, I'm quite surprised there isn't a level 6 AO2 here for the kind of language choices, the terminology that Ipti is using. Now, this bit's interesting for me because what's happened here is I don't think Ipti has made a level 6 point here about the unstable and malevolent fallacy. He hasn't explained what the fallacy is for example. But that doesn't matter because there are so many points that the examiner is already convinced that this is a level 6. And do you remember I said examiners would disagree, and that's perfectly normal. But it's the sheer consistency of using this language that forces the examiner to think, actually, this argument really is coming together. Now, this also shows us an interesting point about context. And most teachers teach, I certainly do, the context being the events of the time. But context is actually broader than that. So a way to easily get marks is to talk about the context of the rest of the play. And that's what's going on here. By linking to what went on in the rest of the play and linking that to the idea of God and Christianity, you're automatically dealing with the context requirement. So if we look at that criteria, a detailed link between the text is enough to get the context mark. That's something that we don't really teach, I think, explicitly to our students. We tend to focus on the context of the time, but actually just having these detailed links is another way of getting the AO3 mark. Okay, now we're going to have a link that I've never taught my students, so I'm really impressed with this one. I'm going to steal it, and I hope you do the same. So we're looking at defeated the treacherous Thane. That was the Thane of Cawdor, you remember, at the beginning. Unseamed him and fixed his head. Now, normally you've memorised unseamed him from the chops to the head, blah, 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 and we talk about Macbeth's level of violence here. But what Ipti has done is he said, no, I'm not talking about his violence, I'm talking about his moral decline, and he's going to use this idea of the head. Watch what he does. The violent verb unseamed marks Macbeth's former combative expertise as he is unfazed by horrific murders. However, more importantly, the head is symbolic as a motif of Macbeth's declining heroism. Now, this is truly conceptualized. You can see that he's going back to that idea of the moral change that he introduced at the beginning, and Macbeth's declining heroism, and he's going to use this image of the head. And because the head is going to recur, it's an image that's going to occur again, he correctly calls that a motif. Vocabulary that I hope you're busily stealing as you take notes from this essay. First, he is at his moral peak as he beheads the king's enemy, effectively God's enemy in the eyes of the contemporary audience. So that is a contextual feature, and the examiner could equally have written here level 6 AO3, but they've chosen to focus on the language. Why? Because you already have proven level 6 AO3, and what the examiner is trying to do is get one level 6 AO1, one level 6 AO3, one level 6 AO2. Once they have spotted that skill once at that level, you get that grade. Bear that in mind, okay? So when you're writing, you need a checklist for yourself. Have I given a contextual level 6? And have I used level 6 terminology? And have I used level 6 ideas about the author? Right, let's get back to it. Then, after having his moral endurance tested in the form of supernatural soliciting, he goes out to commit regicide, losing all virtue. Finally, Shakespeare uses this motif to highlight the negative consequences to his audience, as the head foreshadows Macbeth's later disgrace as his own head becomes described as the usurper's cursed head. So that is a marvellous paragraph in which Ipti points out that Macbeth has gone full circle. At the beginning of the play, he destroys the traitorous head of the Norwegian army, but at the end, he has become that traitorous head. His head is now cursed, and a usurper, someone who takes control, takes power from another, which is what the Norwegian general was. He was attempting to be a usurper invading Scotland. Right, well, in blue, I've highlighted the vocabulary choices that would get AO2 here, okay? So we can see symbolic, motif, contemporary audience, regicide, motif again, consequences and foreshadows. These are all words you need in order to describe a literary text, and these count as subject terminology because of that. Yeah, many students think, oh, you've got to mention the simile and the metaphor and the adverb and the verb and blah, 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 blah. You don't. What you're doing with subject terminology is using expert language, and it's the language that a literature expert needs to use in order to explain ideas. It's not about technique spotting. Right, time to finish this brilliant essay. Jacobean ideas about fate and free will are used by Shakespeare to challenge Macbeth's outlook. As Macbeth reflects on the witch's words, he questions what makes his sealed heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature. Structurally, the juxtaposition, he hasn't spelt it correctly, but never mind, of the adjective seated, which implies firmly grounded, against the verb knock, which has connotations of more liberty, highlights the good nature of fate, which can be altered through the spurs of desire, however, only to shake his state of man with moral instability. Now here we can see that Ipti is cramming too many ideas into the same paragraph. He's not punctuating with full stops properly. He's adding commas instead of the full stop, and no punctuation there at all. But the examiner does not take marks away. What the examiner does is just look for evidence of what you're doing that's good. So here we've got level 6 context, and this is the idea that Shakespeare is challenging Macbeth's outlook, but he's linking that to the Jacobean ideas about fate and free will. And so this helps the examiner say, well, this is still a convincing argument, so it's still conceptualized, even though the execution of these sentences here aren't fully coherent. Right, now Ipti gets back on track again when he talks about Shakespeare teaches with the rhetorical question against the use of nature to highlight Macbeth's moral fragility attained by supplementing God-given fate with supernatural heresies. Shakespeare further presents Macbeth's moral fragility, loss of endurance, and destructively meddled fate as Macbeth invokes the dark stars, hide your fires, let not light see my black and deep desires. The symbolism of stars horrifies Shakespeare's audience as he capitalizes on their Christian faith. They would oppose Macbeth for violating his free will. So we've got this really interesting idea here that Shakespeare is again showing Macbeth's moral fragility, the loss of endurance that was hinted, not hinted, it was expressed very clearly at the beginning. So we're seeing this conceptualized response again, going back to that argument, that thesis that you introduced at the beginning of the essay. And he's introduced a new contextual idea that the fate of Macbeth is actually God-given, because kings were appointed by God, or at least that's how they were perceived at the time. This was called the divine right of kings. So what's going on here is, if the witches are right, Shakespeare is going to become king anyway, because that's part of God's plan. The problem is Macbeth doesn't just trust to God's fate, to God's plan. Instead, he exercises his God-given power of free will for evil. He kills Duncan in order to accelerate when he can become king. He doesn't trust God's plan to make him king when he's ready. And so that's what makes it a heresy. A heresy is a belief that goes against God, so believing in the witches. Not believing that witches exist, that's not the heresy. The heresy is believing in their encouragement towards evil. So we end with, they would oppose Macbeth for violating his free will and predestined ordination, that idea that he was destined to become king, to be ordained as king, that's what that means, with the pagan ritual of invoking other than God. So this is an idea that he hasn't explored in the essay because he hasn't had time, but he's added it into his conclusion. This idea of invoking the powers of evil is a pagan ritual, and actually it's Lady Macbeth that does that. Come, you murdering ministers. Macbeth doesn't, well actually no, he does invoke them, doesn't he, when he goes back to the witches for the second time and asks them to summon their masters so that he can hear their prophecies about Birnam Wood and Macduff. Anyway, that is for another video. What you've seen here is a coherent argument that's run all the way through the essay. So let's go back to the things I wanted you to learn. The idea of moral endurance, which will be relevant to any discussion of Macbeth, Lady Macbeth or Banquo. The idea of the supernatural as a motif, and also we had the idea of the head as a motif as well. How to zoom in on detail, you saw that with the discussion of the usurper's head and the head of the Norwegian general. How to make links across the text, you saw that again with that example. There were loads of vocabulary choices from Macbeth. If you freeze the screen, you can steal some of these. I'm not going to go through them all, but you can see that these words are ones that you can use no matter what the question. That's what makes these super, super valuable. Thank you, IPT, for your vocabulary. I've gone in on detail again. I don't know why. I obviously got overexcited. So we'll get rid of that. So those are the 5 takeaways that I anticipated at the beginning when I planned this video. And the other concept that I've asked you to remember is this idea of outlining your thesis, your argument at the beginning. Well, big thanks to IPT Chowdhury again. If you would like more, do not forget to subscribe because IPT has more essays for us. And indeed, I have lots more advice for you to get 100% in the exam, for you to get the very top grades. Thank you very much and see you soon on my channel.